but we did what George said.
I'd like to introduce Naomi Sims, who's a third-year student in the School of Music at the University of Leeds and playing Brahms' Intermezzo in A. Welcome, everyone. Welcome those of you who are here and those of you who are online somewhere. I'm not sure quite where to look. And also to our fabulous panelists. It's great to see so many of you and to have you participating in different ways. This is a collaboration between the School of Music at the University of Leeds and the Leeds International Piano Competition, known fondly as the Leeds. So if I talk about the Leeds, you know what I'm talking about. I'll tell you a little bit about why we came up with this topic, but the title of today's discussion, and we want you to participate in this discussion too, is Gender Equality, Performance and the Music Industry. For those of you who were here a little early, we had a video from 1966 showing the finalists at that point. And the video was from a competition where Victoria Poznikova, described as the Russian girl, the little Russian girl, was tipped to win by the audience, but in the end she came joint second. So women have been participating in the Leeds International Piano Competition from the very start in 1963. And it leads us from a specific instance of looking at this piano competition to a much broader focus, both on classical music and beyond that to the popular music industry and the persistent questions we have around the participation of women. First of all, I want to introduce our wonderful lineup of audience. Some of them are here virtually, which is fabulous. So I'll start first with Fiona Sinclair, who is the CEO of the Leeds International Piano Competition and will be familiar to many audiences in Leeds. And Fiona participates in a number of joint ventures, and a few months ago we had a fabulous concert next door and a really interesting discussion also with Sally from the Leeds. So it's fantastic you're here. We have another participant who's on a train at the moment and will be joining us as soon as she arrives, and that is Vick Bain. Vick Bain, who is past president of the Independent, formerly known as the Incorporated Society of Musicians, and founder of the F List, a directory of female plus musicians, and a very, very useful resource. She's a report writer and researcher, and she will help us find the connections between the classical context and a broader one. So when she comes in, we'll all probably look absolutely delighted to see her. I'm delighted to welcome a friend and colleague, Dr. Caroline Rae, who's joined us from Cardiff today. She's musicologist and pianist and reader in music at Cardiff University, and she was a former pupil of Fanny Waterman. And Fanny Waterman, as you hear, is the founding force of this competition, and therefore a crucial person. So I'll be asking questions of Caroline, sorry. And then we have Elizabeth French, who's my research assistant on this project, musicologist and pianist at the University of Leeds. And she's been working in the archive with me. And online we have Lydia Artymiw, who's joining us from the United States, who's international pianist with a fabulous reputation, distinguished emeritus professor at the University of Minnesota, and former prize winner at the Leeds International Piano Competition in 1978. And we will be giving a bit of focus on 1978 because it was a great year for women's success in the competition. I'm also delighted that we will be hearing from Ellie Consta, a professional freelance musician based in London and founder of her ensemble. So she will speak through a video during this session too. So, the origins of the Leeds International Piano Competition. Fanny Waterman, a very renowned pianist and piano teacher, and Marion Harewood, or Harwood, depending on the pronunciation, conceived and realized this venture at a time when women rarely held leadership positions in music. In 1963, Waterman fulfilled a dream to make Leeds, which was regarded then as a provincial city, and one wouldn't dare to say that now, of course. She made Leeds into an international musically successful city. Dr. Caroline Rae will tell us what her unique qualities were and what it was like to learn the piano with her, because she was really remarkable. Today's theme of women participation in the Leeds. In 2021, and this helps us think about the focus. What motivates us to have a session, a joint session together to tackle persistent issues, was that there were a good number of women participants and many semi-finalists, but no women on this particular occasion made it to the final. And it did attract some discussion from the BBC Music magazine and several blogs noted that that was the case. Since its inception in 1963, women have been placed but have rarely won the first prize. There are two exceptions, 2009 and 2015. Armetta Adams came fourth in the first year, so there's always been a sense of participation. And it's an issue that the Leeds is keen to explore. We will hear shortly some very interesting data about this and other competitions from Fiona. However, it taps into a much deeper societal issue that goes well beyond any particular competition or any particular institution. So Leeds and the University of Leeds and the Leeds competition work closely together, and we were motivated to ask the question about the place of women in piano competitions and in the industry more widely. A number of questions we'll be looking at. Has anything changed since 1963? We'll hear the perspective of freelance musician Ellie Consta from a younger generation. How does the classical music industry differ from other parts of the music industry? I'll be asking Vick Bain, who's a leading expert in her field, an advocate of women and the pop industry. The University of Leeds is proud to have the Fanny Waterman archives. Elizabeth and I have started to explore these, and they're very rich. There's a lot there, and we're only beginning to tap the surface in order to tell some stories and to bring those stories to life. We've also, at the same time, been interviewing figures from the music industry. We need to be positive, though. What solutions do we have that might make a difference? We'll be calling on our experts and our audiences, whether you're seated here or online, to think this through together. So let's start, and I'm going to start by asking Caroline a few questions, because Caroline, you had a unique experience, an important experience of studying with Fanny Waterman from a young age. So first of all, what was distinctive and unique about Fanny Waterman's approach as a teacher?
I don't know if this is switched on or what. Right, can you hear? Well, first of all, it was a tremendous privilege. But for one, it wasn't unique, of course, though she had many pupils. But you knew right from the beginning, whatever age you were, it was a privilege, and you were there to work hard. But you wanted to work hard. And you would turn up for your lesson, and as you walked in, the wonderful music room she had at the house in Woodgarth, in Oakwood, it sounded like the Leeds International Piano Competition all the time. So that wasn't necessarily me, I have to say, but it was an inspiration that the environment that immediately you stepped into. She always demanded the highest standards. It doesn't matter if you were 5 or 15 or 25. There was no, that just wasn't debatable, you know, the highest standards. And people responded to that, and they gave, which meant when you were preparing for a lesson, I realized looking back that all of us, all of her pupils, prepared lessons as if you were each week preparing for a recital at the Wigmore Hall. That was how dedicated you were, because it was dedication, perspiration, and hopefully that would produce inspiration. Now, I have to confess, that's not one of my phrases. That was one of Fanny's favourite phrases that she liked to do. But one of the things that she had was the most incredible attention to detail, and a willingness, therefore, to spend an entire lesson on a single phrase or even a single chord. I remember having a 2-hour lesson on the first 8 bars of the Chopin Third Ballade. you know, and it really made me think about it. That was typical. We all had that kind of thing. But that, yes, she was hard and tough in her demands, but that was the crucible through which we learned and gained our own confidence. So she was inspiring, but also demanding. Let me tell you a couple of little anecdotes. In terms of inspiration, so there was one lesson, but I'd be about 14, right? And I'd been working very earnestly on this Beethoven sonata. It was Opus 2, number 2. One doesn't forget. And it was the minuet and trio, scherzo and trio. And I played it very earnestly. You always began the lesson with a performance. So performing was always instilled at you right from the word go. So it was a performance. And, well, it was a bit lackluster. And to which Fanny responded, a little unexpectedly. She said, I can't quite do Fanny's Leeds accent. My dear friend Ben Frith is very, very good at Fanny's accent. She said, well, Caroline, that's all very well. But when I look out of my French windows here, because it was the beautiful room that looked onto a beautiful garden, these beautiful French windows, and it's spring, and I see the daffodils come up, and I look, and there are squirrels jumping, and the trees come, and I think, and I turn in here and listen to you and think, ugh. Now, that might have been perhaps a deflation to somebody, but I thought that was very funny. And because she was absolutely right. And what followed was one of the most inspiring lessons that we had, how to release that musicality. And that was one of the things that she was so good at, is inspiring interpretation, not imposing interpretation, but trying to release your own imagination to bring to it, to find the conviction of what you wanted to say. So she always had lots of stories to bring.
That's fascinating to hear, and also it accords with the conversations I've had with Ben Frith and with Jonathan Dunsby, both of whom were star pupils, alongside you, of course, but star pupils of Fanny's, and studied with her for a long time. And Ben Frith has had a remarkable career as a pianist. They talked about her musicality and her musicianship and how she really did something remarkable. So, yeah,
there's one very important thing I must say, though. Okay, technique. She didn't teach technique through studies. Well, but few little. She was patient. She would practice with you in lessons. Only good teachers do that. But the core of her teaching was how to be a poet, how to find the poetry, and how to make the piano sing. Because the piano is probably the least musical of instruments. It's not powered by breath. It's not powered by the bow. It's a percussive instrument. So how do you overcome that? And that was one of her core things.
Fascinating. So to be a fabulous music teacher in Leeds is one thing, but then to go on and to found an international society, institution of the highest order, how did that happen? What motivated her to establish this?
Well, of course, Fanny became nationally a highly eminent teacher during the 1950s. She had very successful pupils who played concertos with John Barbaroli and the Proms and with the Halle Orchestra and the Festival Hall, all before the age of 12. Right, well, that puts you on the map as a teacher. But I think secretly she kind of resented being a local piano teacher, because that's what it boils down to, what it is in a sense. I mean, it's sort of obviously a lot more than that. But so she was thinking, I think, how can she bring her very substantial gifts to bear that will enable the wider international pianistic community to benefit? And one also needs to think that at the time she thought up the Leeds International Piano Competition, there wasn't a major international music competition in the UK at that time. What did we have? We had Moscow, We had it was the Warsaw shopping competition. You had the Quarto competition. But there was nothing in the UK. Brussels, of course, had already been founded by this time. But the UK didn't have anything. I mean, there are now international competitions all over the place. But so Fanny had that, the idea at the right time.
Thank you. That's interesting. And I think she, partly because her husband said, no, you couldn't do it in Leeds. And she proved him wrong, didn't she? Well, the archives tell us really interesting stories. And one thing I noticed in the time I've looked at it was the networks that she establishes, the other competitions she starts to go around, the juries. So she's constantly feeding and growing a sort of an international network. So I want to turn to Elizabeth French to ask you really about what you found and about your focus, particularly on a very important year, 1978.
Thank you, Barbara. Yes, for the purposes of this evening's event, we thought it would be interesting to choose an iteration of the Leeds where women were well represented and examine the way this was presented to the public, as well as gathering the opinions of the women themselves. And 1978, as we've already said, is an interesting year in the history of the Leeds because for the first time, the majority of competitors in the final, 4 out of 6, were female. In fact, that 4 equals the total number of women who'd reached the final round in the previous 5 iterations of the competition. Unfortunately, Diana Caxo, who came second that year, died in 2022. And I failed until yesterday to contact Etsuko Terada, who came 6th, and still Ian Hobson, for a male point of view, which I believe is really important when you're considering these matters. However, Lydia Artymiw, who joins us this evening, and Catherine Stott, who came 5th in 1978 at the age of 19, have both been kind enough to spend time speaking to me about the competition, and some of their thoughts are included in what I'm going to say. Some brief statistics to start. There were 201 applications for the 1978 Leeds. Of the 95 competitors chosen and listed in the programme, 28 were women. That's around the average for the competition as a whole over the years, which, according to Linda Wellings, sits at around 30%. When the field was whittled down, 12 of the 23 remaining, more than half, were female. By the semi-final, 60% of the remaining field of 10 was female. And as mentioned previously, that became 2/3 for the final. It's also interesting to note that only 2 of the jury of 15 that year was female, Akiko Iguchi and Phyllis Selick. Rosalind Turek was due to be on the jury but had to withdraw before the competition. That's the lowest proportion of any iteration, so one probably can't ascribe female success to any bias on behalf of female jury members. Of immediate interest to me was the press coverage of the 1978 competition. The archive is full of scrapbooks of cuttings, and of course they lead on to other cuttings that you then go and find. The world was a different place with regard to press propriety in the late 1970s. The Sun, of course, still had page 3 girls, and the Yorkshire Evening Post, which reported the Leeds in some detail, had cover girls in quite a lot of its editions. So it was of little surprise to me to find an article about Kristen Mercer, who was the youngest competitor that year, aged 17. The Yorkshire Evening Post began an article, "Lovely Kristen Maria Mercer," continuing to call her a West German miss who wants to be a professional pianist. Alongside the short article is a very large front-on photograph of a blonde, smiling Miss Mercer, and comparison with other newspaper articles shows that the large size and tight focus of the photograph was more than might be expected when compared to the length of the article. Despite not reaching the final 6, Kristen Mercer, who herself has gone on to have a performing career and has spent the last 30 years as a professor of piano at the Hochschule für Musik Saar in Saarbrücken, was the subject of quite a few articles, accompanied by photographs of various sizes, possibly due to her being the youngest competitor in the competition, but also almost certainly because she was attractive, and the newspaper editors felt that readers would engage with her story. Photographs of female pianists were also used regularly to illustrate stories about the competition in general. One example is an article in The Guardian on the first finals day of 1978 that had a photograph of Catherine Stott playing, and yet hardly mentioned her in the text. There are several other examples of now quite dated language, female competitors being described as girl, even in 1978. The Yorkshire Evening Post article on the 9th of September, "Nationality a puzzle for festival girl Helene," that's Helen Varvarova, and 2 different articles in the same newspaper referring to the Japanese girl, Etsuko Terada. Nowhere in the same publication were any of the men referred to as boy. Incidentally, on the subject of Helen Varvarova, her story led to a 200-word article in the Evening Post about her family and her difficult decision to leave Russia for Paris, where she currently works as a housekeeper, the newspaper told us. Curiously, towards the end of the article, it mentioned that her boyfriend, pianist Mikhail Rudy, who left Russia at the same time as Hélène, is also in Leeds. About him, the newspaper adds that in March, he'll perform in London with the London Philharmonic Orchestra. No mention of anything that poor Hélène is doing. Reference to female appearance isn't just confined to the local press at competition time itself. In the 6 months following the competition, Diane Caxay was referred to as both attractive and charming in local papers around the country. And Catherine Stott was described as having a slight frame that concealed astonishing reserves of stamina and strength. The physical abilities of Diana were also discussed in the Times in 1980, stating that although Liszt's Mazeppa is the most demanding transcendental etude, particularly in terms of physical endurance, Max Harrison wrote that Miss Caxay's was a very brave attempt. There are, of course, plenty of newspaper articles in which the female pianist is not subject to any remarks about her femininity. Following the competition, John de la Cour in the Birmingham Daily Post referred to Diana Caxay as a pianist in the grand manner, and David Chesterman, reviewing a performance of the Liszt Sonata that she gave in November 1978, wrote that he had never heard a performance so integrated, so intellectually stimulating, since hearing Horowitz play it in 1951. Diana Caxay is interesting when we consider the post-Leeds careers of pianists. She performed a lot in the immediate aftermath of the competition, garnering high praise from critics in the Times and local edition newspapers such as the Grimsby Daily Telegraph, who described her in 1980 as a quite remarkable and outstanding talent. Although the article, incidentally written by somebody called F.W., did end a fantastic performance. What a woman! Exclamation mark. However, according to Norman Lebrecht on his Slipped Disc webpage, Diana Caxay recorded one album for Deutsche Grammophon and then took a 20-year career break, only returning to performance in 2007. An obituary published online by the Willig Funeral Home last year states that this was to devote her time and energy to her children. And certainly, family considerations are a big part of being a professional female musician. Lydia Artymiw, who we'll hear from, didn't have children, a fact she ascribes to her hectic touring schedule in the early years after her marriage. Catherine Stott, who had a daughter in the early 1980s, said that, looking back, she doesn't know how she managed performing and touring with a small child. It was just something that needed to be done. And that attitude's also present in conversations I've had with other female pianists, admittedly all over the age of 40, both involved with the Leeds and not. They don't see themselves as female as much as pianists. As a quick aside, I should mention here that even after winning the Leeds in 1981, Ian Hobson was quoted in one article as having made a conscious decision to confine his touring to 6 months of each year so that he could be at home with his young family. Aside from the fact that many musicians, including Ian Hobson, quoted in the Yorkshire Evening Post before the semi-finals of 1978, struggle with the concept of performance as being competitive, the piano competition in general was seen as a means to an end. Being successful somewhere like the Leeds would lead to signing with an agent, being booked for engagements, and so forth. Catherine Stott believes that anyone finds competitions a problem because, in her words, your life is on the line. She doesn't feel it's natural to compete as a musician. Having also served on the jury for an international competition and seeing the reality for people when they're knocked out, she feels that competitions are brutal experiences. Unfortunately, it is the case that the industry operates almost entirely on a mixture of subjective opinion and diary availability. However, within the competition environment, there is, as a competitor, no consideration of being different because of being female. Certainly back in the 1970s and 1980s, and from my experience in the early 2000s, one wouldn't use gender and the problems it might cause, such as during the female monthly cycle, for example, which Catherine told me could affect her memory as well as her general feeling of wellness, as any kind of reason or excuse within the profession. Catherine told me she would be amazed if people gave their own gender a thought during the competition in 1978, but added that, of course, she had no ideas what jurors, agents, and audiences were thinking. And this is a shortcoming of this kind of research. Without the input of the decision makers, jurors, agents, and so on, which we're unlikely to be able to get, we'll never know for certain why people were or are chosen for competitions, concerts, and so on, and why others aren't. Catherine Stott ascribes some of her success after the 1978 competition to the fact that concert promoters in the UK were looking for a British pianist to promote. And Ian Hobson, the other Briton in the final, was, and still is, based in the USA. Despite being young, with a limited repertoire, and unsure of which career path she wanted to follow within classical music, she feels that she got a lot of work because of the 1978 competition. A competition gives you a window of opportunity, she said, and it's up to you what you do with it. Catherine also pointed out there are so many more pianists now, it's much harder to make an impact. In 1978, the impact of the competition itself seemed very big. To conclude, whilst a study based on the 1978 competition is very interesting from the point of view of historical perspective, it's not necessarily particularly informative of concerns and matters to be addressed going forwards. As is not surprising, the views expressed in the press and elsewhere in 1978 are very much of their time, with the culture being much more accepting, or at least less critical, of views which today might be seen as inappropriate or even impermissible. As a pianist myself, I remember a local newspaper wanting to write a report on my success at a competition in Canada in the early 2000s, and the photographer taking some time to get a smiley, pretty picture for the paper. Of course, alongside development in opinion regarding gender, with the arrival and development of social media in the last 20 years, pianists have had so many more ways to promote themselves, leading to the market seeming much more full. Competitions such as the Leeds provide an opportunity, albeit subjective, to raise oneself above the general melee of musicians all seeking agents and bookings. For a more in-depth study, I'd be very interested to get the views of female competitors from a variety of years between 1981 and the present, to see whether competitors in more recent iterations of the Leeds have different views on this matter.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth. It was really fascinating reflection of the 1978 competition and the implications it has for some of the questions that we continue to ask. So thanks so much for that. There was one article in the Times from 14th September 1978 that caught my eye, and it was entitled Women Shine in Leeds Piano Contest. And the quotation goes, "After years of male domination, women are coming strongly to the fore in this year's triennial Leeds International Piano Competition, offering the strong possibility that for the first time since the competition started in 1963, it will be won by women. After 23 pianists who have won prizes at the Leeds competitions, only 4 have been women, but this year they're made up of 6 of 10 semi-finalists. Among them are at least 2 potential winners, Lydia Artymiw from the United States and Diana Caxo from Brazil." And the article describes Lydia, her performance of Schumann. It says, "It displays a beauty and insight that had observers in delight." So it is our delight and a huge honour to welcome Lydia to this event. And please welcome Lydia Artymiw. Lydia,
Thank you.
I think I'm looking in the right direction so you can see me. I'm
Yes,
tempted to look
of
over
course.
my shoulder, but I'll resist. So there's so many things we could ask you, and we've already had some lovely conversations, both Elizabeth and myself. But we want to ask you what it was like to compete for an intensive 3-week period in the Leeds International Piano Competition.
Well, it was very grueling, very challenging in every way, and perhaps the most difficult aspect was to retain one's stamina and focus because, you know, we had 4 rounds to play. Those of us who were fortunate to pass into the next round, it was thrilling to pass. But at the same time, the responsibility, I think, grew even more difficult. But 3 weeks, I mean, after all, a big competition, major competition, such as Leeds, Clyburn, Tchaikovsky, Brussels. I mean, as Caroline said, there are so many international competitions. Rubinstein, they're generally 2.5 to 3 weeks. And the main purpose of the competition is not only to launch an aspiring young pianist to hopefully a major career, but it's also a testing ground. And it's therefore very important to see whether the pianists who are competing can indeed in effect, survive and maintain that kind of concentration and stamina that is so important. I mean, what was the most difficult for me was that of the 6 finalists, I was the only one who did not have a break between the semifinals and the finals. So the day before, I had performed the Schubert A minor, Opus 42 Sonata, and the Schumann Piano Quintet with the Gabrieli Quartet, and we had a rehearsal, I think, that morning. And then the results going into the finals were announced by dinner time. And I recall that I was supposed to rehearse the Brahms D minor concerto at 10 o'clock the next morning with the performance that evening. This was also the first time that I would perform the Brahms with orchestra. So it was even more nerve-wracking for me. And I remember that evening I was exhausted, but I had to go practice. I mean, it would not be possible not to practice the Brahms the day before, prior to rehearsal and performance. So it really is ultimately, truly a test of everything. And determination, discipline, stamina, but it's an important test.
Wow, you give such a vivid sense of what it must, the intensity and the stamina required to keep going and not having a break. We think of tennis players and in that sort of context. Caroline, you're going to say...
Just to sort of to tag on to something Lydia just said, is that one of the very valuable things about a piano competition, a major piano competition from the point of view of the pianist, is your repertoire prep. Because if you're in the profession, you got to have 2 or 3 recital programs and 3 or 4 concertos ready to go, and that concerto is ready to go when Bloggs is ill, and all that kind of thing. But it's in a competition, it's probably the first time you've got all that stuff together. So it really is a major testing ground. And I was at your semi-final, Lydia, and some of the earlier stages. I was so inspired, I went out and bought one of your records straight away, because I think I think in one of the earlier stages, didn't you play the Haydn F minor variations? Well,
yes.
I have your record, and I learnt it myself.
Fantastic.
You're so kind. That really touches my heart. Thank you.
Well, that's a lovely example of the inspiration that can come from experiencing the performance at this amazing level. So, Lydia, I'm interested to know if you were conscious of any gender issues when competing. I know you were focusing on the piano and on your determination to do as well as you could. How do you feel you were treated by the press, by any other context, really?
Oh, I was not thinking at all about any gender issues. I felt that everyone was treated beautifully. We had wonderful accommodations, and what I especially valued were the times that we were able to go into private homes to practice. And I forged friendships with 2 couples with whom I've kept in touch since 1978, and even continued visiting one of the couples in Leeds. So these became lifelong friendships, which I truly cherish. But as far as, no, I don't think there was any issue of gender at all. And actually, I mean, I was really excited when we found out that there were 4 women in the finals. This seemed extraordinary to me, and actually very proud of all of us. I felt that this was a wonderful achievement. I already knew Ian Hobson, and so, you know, it felt like we had many friends within us, within the finalists. It was a good feeling.
That's wonderful. And my final...
I'm sorry, as far as the press, the one thing I want to say is just like Victoria Postnikova was frequently called the Russian girl, I was called the American girl. And I mean, maybe it's because my name is too difficult to pronounce, but the other thing that was amusing, later on, one of my friends had saved all the various clippings from all the newspapers, and how often the critics or people who were writing stories about the Leeds would almost place bets. So it was almost as though they were placing bets with horses at a horse race. And I found that sometimes perhaps going a bit too far, but it was amusing. And I feel that the press coverage was very helpful. I didn't read the reviews till much later, so I did not allow anything that was in the press to have any influence on me. My primary and only focus was to try to play my best. So.
Fantastic. Thank you, Lydia. What difference did your success in the Leeds and in other competitions make to your career?
Oh, it was tremendous. I mean, first and most important for me was that Brian Cousins heard me. He was the founder of Chandos Records. And even though I won third prize, he approached me about the possibility of doing some recordings. And we had a wonderful, very fruitful relationship. I did 7 solo recordings for Chandos. And actually, the recording that Caroline mentioned with the Haydn variations, it also included variations of Mozart and Mendelssohn and Beethoven. I did the Beethoven Opus 34, which I had performed in the competition. And that was selected by Gramophone in 1981, I think, as Best of the Year, which was unbelievable, something I never could have imagined. And I was actually even on the cover of Gramophone for one of their issues. So it did offer me the opportunity to garner some concerts in England, in Scotland. I had a wonderful tour with the Scottish National Orchestra, with Sir Alexander Gibson conducting Rachmaninoff's Second Concerto. I had my Wigmore Hall debut, and I also played the Rachmaninoff Second with the BBC Northern, again, the orchestra with whom I played the Brahms in Manchester, and did some BBC programs. And then there were smaller recitals. There was one for the Law Society, Plymouth, Grisdale, Rose Hill. And I also remember coming to Leeds, where I did something I've never done since, played 2 recitals in one day, 2 different programs. One at noon at the town hall, and then a different program that evening at the university. The next morning, I was on a very early train to Hull, where I performed the Grieg Concerto with the Hull Philharmonic. And after that, the manager of the orchestra drove a Rolls Royce, and he actually allowed me to drive it around the block. One of the most thrilling experiences I ever had. So again, what I spoke about earlier, stamina, being able to survive even under such pressure, playing 2 different recitals in one day, followed by the Grieg Concerto the next day. That took a lot out of me, but I felt just inspired, and it was so exciting. And every day, every concert was special and meaningful. So yes, it built a career, but it was also just having opportunities that I never would have had before. So I was enormously grateful.
Caroline, come on.
Bursting to make a comment, actually. One of the things that really helped pianist careers, even if they didn't get into the finals, only the semi-finals, was the BBC coverage in the 70s and 80s. Everything was on Radio 3, and the finals were live on BBC One. And you were invited to tune back in at sort of 10:30 at night to get the live finals. So, I mean, this is something to put straight at Fanny's door of success. And her, she was a tremendous role model. She knew no fear. Field Marshal Fanny, I think she liked to be called and was often called. But she achieved that coverage, which was good for the competition, and it was good for the pianist taking part.
Okay. Thank you, Caroline. Lydia, it's fantastic talking to you, and we want to draw on you when we come to looking at solutions about how we encourage women performers to have the same, I suppose, determination and intensity of work and career as you have had. So we'll draw on you again, but hopefully you enjoy the next part of our discussion, where we're going to look at what the data tells us about the gender gap in piano competitions. And Fiona Sinclair, the CEO of the Leeds, is going to give us a presentation that allows us to reflect on this. Thank you very much, Lydia, and welcome, Fiona.
Thank you so much. Just so fantastic to hear it all come to life through the memories of one of our dear, cherished pianists. It's so grateful to Lydia for sharing that with us. It's lovely to be here today, and thank you so much for coming and taking such an interest in our journey as a competition. It's a great opportunity to explore this topic with you here today. The issue of gender in the music industry is complex, and so today we are only looking at a very tiny area of it around piano competitions, and that's partly because, primarily because we continue to see a sizable gender gap in piano specifically. I'd like to show you what we found out about the talent pipeline. That's the pathway that takes musicians through their education, come through music competitions like the Leeds, and then into the careers into the music industry. So first of all, I should just say this is a picture with Nadia Boulanger, who frequently sat on the jury at Leeds, and this is one of her most quoted statements. First of all, I just want to tell you our story from the 2021 competition in Leeds and what we've since discovered. So in 2021, to the surprise of all involved, we ended the 20th Leeds International Piano Competition with a single gender final, all men. You can see in this photo, the front row, all the boys, and on the second row of the 4 female semi-finalists who didn't make it through. Our jurors vote in secret and there's no discussion, so there was no visibility on the result until it was announced. The jury voted for different women, splitting the vote, so no single individual received enough votes to qualify, but it was very close. First of all, the reaction of our jury was really difficult. Some were very upset, and one juror even threatened to resign. As soon as the names were announced, they knew they would be accused of bias. Sure enough, on social media, there was widespread speculation that the majority of men on the jury, 7 men to 2 women, was the reason why only men progressed to the finals. In our defence, it was COVID times, and the original jury had more women on it, but we'd had to swap out some people at the last minute. But it didn't help the optics, shall we say. When we announced the names just over the road in the Great Hall from the stage, what should have been a really happy, exciting moment turned sour as we saw the disappointment and disbelieving reactions of our volunteers, our audience, the production crew. The number of men on stage looked and felt wrong. And the very next day, me and my team set about looking at what had happened with the support of every single one of our trustees and to see how we might be able to prevent it happening again. So we started by reviewing our data, and we found that only 10% of all of our first prize winners, that's 2 out of the 20 competitions we've run so far, have been women. About a quarter of finalists have been women in total. And shamefully, this has actually dropped to 18% over the past 4 competitions. As a female CEO of a female-founded piano competition, this is really painful to me personally. But that might sound bad. It's not at all unique among piano competitions. We reviewed 20 of the major piano competitions that took place in 2022, and we found that only 3 out of 20, or 15% of first prize winners were women. Like us, a quarter of finalists were women, and 40%, that's 8 out of 20 competitions, had all male finals, just like us. In addition, it's interesting to note that 1/3 of the jury places were women, and only 4 out of the 20 were chaired by women. I just want to digress briefly to show you the stats from recent major violin competitions. As you can see, in stark contrast to the piano, 75% of first prize winners are women, and there are well over half of the finalists are women, and there are no single gender finals. I think it's important to state this before we jump to generalized conclusions about classical music as a whole being gender biased. There are, of course, instruments that tend to be highly gendered, for instance, brass instruments, and I think that's a hugely fascinating area of study all in itself. But I think it's a bit of a surprise to say that two such popular and common instruments, the violin and the piano, are gendered, because it's not obvious. It's not the first thing that jumps to mind, but in fact, it seems you're much more likely to win a violin competition if you're a woman than a piano competition. So to go back to the piano pipeline, we went back a step and looked at the education of pianists in the UK, and we found that piano specialism at GCSE and in sort of secondary school is equal between boys and girls. In ABRSM piano exams, the girls are slightly ahead, and then the gap increases even more when we look at piano admissions into UK conservatoires, which shows that 59% of women, 59% in 2022 were women. Now, we haven't compared or collated a lot of data with other countries, but I think that's really interesting. We did actually ask the top conservatoires in China for their admissions data, and we found it was broadly the same. About 60% of admissions to conservatoire for piano are women, 10% more than men. So then we look beyond the competition phase of a career, of a pianist's career, to look at those who are making it, sustaining a career as an artist. And we looked at the data from IAMA, that stands for the International Artist Managers Association. It's the Classical Music Agents Association. And they annually publish a list of all the artists that they represent represented by their members. And we found that only 23% of pianists with those agents are women. So that's a pretty good measure that represents the balance of women pianists who are having lifelong careers. So put all of that together and you have a scissors diagram. This is seen in all sorts of spheres where there's a pipeline that leads to elite achievement and recognition. And for us women in the room, it's hard to look at that and let that sink in, but it's also replicated in academia and all sorts of science and all sorts of fields. It seems the diagram crosses over after conservatoire studies, which indicates that women are studying piano to a high level, but they don't go on to win major prizes and sustain lifelong careers. Now, nobody would say that men are better pianists than women, so we need to understand what's going on. Of course, the next thing I did was talk to loads of colleagues and try and unpick this. And I discovered that we all fall into the trap of making generalizations. And please forgive me if I say these, if I offend anybody by saying these out loud, because some of them are quite difficult to stomach. First of all, there's a difference in the resilience and persistence of men and women. Men are just more persistent. I heard that from pretty much everyone I spoke to. In fact, there is some kernel of truth. There's some recent research from a Danish-led university team who have been looking into historic data around the gender gap in piano competitions. They've found out that women drop out of the competition circuit after a setback much faster than men, but if they persist, they have an almost equal chance of winning a prize as a man. This means that women are falling out of the profession before they've had the chance to prove themselves. Men also take more risks and have a go, whereas women suffer from insecurities and imposter syndrome and won't apply until they're over-prepared. Women have smaller hands for the piano and can struggle to project in a 3,000-seater hall with an orchestra. It's actually true that women do tend to win more competitions when they're focused on Bach and Mozart, which require a smaller hand span.
Lydia played brass, won.
There you go. And it's true that Rachmaninoff and Tchaikovsky does require a huge handspan. The other thing I was told was, anecdotally, women pianists are much more likely to sustain injuries that will cause them to drop out of the performance circuit, although that tends to be over the longer term of a career, and there's no robust data on that. And lastly, the family question, or the motherhood penalty, as Vick calls it. Less of an issue perhaps in the UK, but it can have a real impact on the commercial viability of an artist in far too many promoters' eyes around the world. The reason I'm including these things is because they're the kind of explanations that have been given by people in leadership positions, competitions, jurors, heads of piano departments, conservatoires, agents and promoters. Without collating better quality research and data, following through conversations like this, these gendered opinions just strengthen unhelpful and extremely biased generalizations and prevent us from seeing the structural biases that are actually contributing to this gender gap. The deficit we're seeing is unintentional, I believe. So awareness of these structural inequalities is key. Vick has far more interesting things to say about this, so I'm just going to jump into a few areas that I feel affect us particularly. First one is meritocracy. As an industry, we place a lot of importance on the individual. It's a culture in music where success and failure are based on how talented or how hard someone works rather than their privilege and status. We're collecting information about our applicants because we feel that we're maybe missing some information about their backgrounds. We like to ask them about where they trained and who they had masterclasses and things with, but actually I did speak to somebody the other day in Beijing who asked me what to do about getting a reference for their student who wanted to apply because they were coming from quite a small town in the back of China somewhere, and they said, well, we don't know anybody famous or highly esteemed to write the reference, and this was a barrier to them applying, although it wasn't actually a problem for us, but bias. I've heard so many times our jury only listens to the music, but bias exists in every one of us, and you can only eliminate it by bringing attention to it. The bias that plays out in competitive situations is particularly extreme because we're not only looking for great musicianship, we're looking for careers we can launch. The next one, dominant personalities. Leading on from that, juries are full of dominant personalities with strong opinions, and that comes with equally strong biases. We have to help our jurors address this so that we can get what we need from them, which is their ability to find a truly unique musician who has beauty and poetry that can inspire wider society. And just you mentioned it earlier on a little bit, but to talk about the effect of a jury's gender balance for a moment, this Danish-led research team we've been looking at found that there's no difference on the votes of juries with more or less women. It seems that both men and women jurors may be equally biased towards male contestants where piano is concerned. Just very quickly, in piano, there are fewer role models, which we do need more female winners to model the representation that it is possible for women to win these competitions. And finally, we do, as an international piano competition, we connect with many cultures around the world where the expectations and ambitions for women are very different to men, and we must be more in tune with that. As an international competition, it's really important that we create that level playing field for competitors. We've looked at the risks of not addressing this, staying relevant to our audiences who expect equity, and as I said, it just absolutely looked wrong. We need to create role models for the next generation. We have a very fragile economic climate that affects our ability to raise funds, which create opportunities for young musicians. We're only talking about gender today, but addressing equity, diversity and inclusion needs to be intentional and impactful for all organisations, all arts organisations. And many of our arts partners, we work closely with the BBC orchestras and BBC Radio 3 and Medici TV and also Warner Classics. And they actually have diversity targets. And if we don't meet their expectations of successful prize winners of competitions, then we'll be failing what they're looking for in the industry, and we'll be losing all of these unique musical voices. The pipeline that we're feeding will break, and we'll lose opportunity for our musicians' careers. I won't necessarily, because I think I'm probably spoken for too long, but at the competition, we've taken this incredibly seriously. We've gone through every single layer of the competition process and looking for opportunities where we can take action. We're measuring our data and monitoring as we go forward. We're increasing representation in our programme, on our jury, in our repertoire, just all the other artistic programmes that we mount at the Leeds, including our schools programme and Piano Trail. Bias is something we're really excited to be working on, because we're creating what we think is the first ever jury training in the world, and we think there's great opportunity to share that with other competitions so that they can adopt a similar approach. And based on the findings of the Danish team, our Competitor Plus programme is there to support and encourage our artists, particularly women, but all of our artists, to help them be better equipped with the tools that they need for navigating this uneven playing field. And today, sharing our knowledge and thoughts is a really vital part of our journey, and I'm so grateful to you for all joining us on this. In the music community, we are very interdependent, and if we lead a movement on this, others will follow, and hopefully this is a conversation that we won't need to have in the future.
Fiona, thank you so much for a really fascinating presentation. You've identified a lot of the challenges, but also proposing some positive action, and it's really interesting to hear. Interesting to hear what you say about patronage as well, and how that is an element in the whole mix. So I think you've given us a lot to think about, and in the interval, we're going to have an interval, but we're going to come back to look at the popular music industry and to broaden out some of these questions. So first of all, I'm going to tell you what the audience question is for you to muse over while you listen to some music, but also maybe grab a drink from the bar. And the question is, and there are QR codes around, aren't there? They're there for the in-person. They're there. Brilliant. Okay, the question is, what should we do to address the decline in women's participation in brackets, classical music profession after training? Because I think that was a very powerful thing that Fiona showed, that as many, perhaps more women, more young females are learning the piano and certainly through the training stages. But it's at the time of choosing the career where that tends to drop off, and of course that has an impact on the sort of professional music industry in general. So I'd like you to think about that. There's a QR code there. But before we stop, I am so delighted to welcome Vick Bain, who has come all the way from Cornwall and on many trains, some of which had broken down, but was so determined to be with us, and we're very relieved because I don't think we could have done without you. So please welcome Vick Bain. And okay. And we'll be starting off after the break. So the break is quick. You're going to have to be very quick running to the bar. That's fine. The bar is going to be open for half an hour at the end, so you can talk to the panellists. You can talk to all of us. And I'm grateful to Linka Greasley, my colleague, professor, and Dory here in the School of Music for dealing with our online audience, and we'll be feeding back some of the comments that we're getting in from them. Okay, so enjoy your break. I will call you to attention when I need you to sit down. It's going to be about 10 minutes. Caroline's worried already. Anyway, do enjoy your break. Thank you. Welcome back, everyone. And let's thank Naomi Sims for performing Rachmaninoff Melodie, Morceau de Fantaisie. So there's still time to fill in the various questions. So please do so, because we're going to come to this in a little while. But first of all, I want to ask Vick Bain, who've already introduced you before you arrived, and then, of course, when you're here, with the relief on my face being palpable. But you heard Fiona's presentation. And I want to ask you, what are the similarities between the piano competition world, which Fiona was focusing on in particular, and the popular music world, which you have studied so much?
Well, thank you very much for inviting me here and being patient while I travelled. I feel like I've come from Australia, but only Cornwall. So hello everyone. Yes, I've got experience in all genres of music across the music industry. I have worked in classical music when I was chief executive of the British Academy of Songwriters, Composers and Authors, and we ran the British Composer Awards, but we also ran the Ivor Novello Awards, which focuses on pop rock, television and film composing, actually. So I've got lots of experience there as well. And I have to say, it doesn't actually matter what genre of music you are looking at and researching, we see the same patterns and the same phenomena, because all of these statistics are a result of social forces, shall we say. So this drop-off after university to the rest of the music industry is repeated in pop music just as much as it is in classical music, if that is reassuring. So it's not like classical music is worse than any other, and in fact in many areas it's doing better. In terms of professional musicians signed to record labels, and actually the classical music genre has the highest percentage of women signed to UK record labels at about 30%, and other genres are even worse. But we still see this this hierarchy. So women tend to be prevalent was in the business side, in the entry level unpaid or lesser paid roles, and the further up the management structure you go, there are fewer women. And we see the same pattern with creative musicians as well. So women dominate in amateur music, or the lesser sort of paid, lesser status roles, and that includes teaching, music teaching. Women predominate there, and the higher status, higher paid roles at the top, and this could be headlining in music festivals or being signed to major record labels. It's all men, and majoritively white men at the top.
That is fascinating, and in terms of sort of, I suppose, opportunity, your point that there are many women involved in the industry, but they're in those lesser, more precarious roles. So, what do you think puts them off from achieving those higher, more important status?
Yeah, it's very complex. There's lots of things going on, but I think our gender social roles it has, is quite an important part of that. So we across all parts of our society, we do job roles according to our sex. So, men will do one type of job or have a certain type of career pathway, and women will have another. And we are sort of encouraged and guided into those roles. So women are more likely to be guided or encouraged to go into teaching And some of that is actually in preparation for the fact that at some point in a woman's life, she might consider having children. And if she has children, she will be the primary caretaker. Or even, by the time she gets to my age, I've got many friends in music who are now trying to juggle their careers with caring for elderly parents. They chose not to have children in order that their careers could be more easily managed, and now they still have caretaking duties. So this stereotyping and sort of being encouraged into certain directions, and preparation for motherhood. And there's also other behavioural problems across our society, but in music with regards to discrimination, harassment, and sexual harassment as well. So I hear a lot about how you said, Fiona, very succinctly earlier that maybe women aren't as confident enough and so on. Or are more likely to drop out of a particular competition or career pathway. But why? Why is that? And actually, a reason could be the fact that women are more likely to experience discrimination, harassment, blocking behaviours, controlling behaviours, across a whole spectrum of behaviours. But I'm doing, conducting a PhD, looking at women's careers. I'm interviewing a lot of women, and the stories that they are telling me about how they're being controlled or have experienced different aspects of control in their career pathways is extraordinary. And one of the most damaging aspects of that is being on the receiving end of sexual harassment and discrimination.
Those are quite powerful stories, and I imagine the research you are doing is really fascinating in sort of bringing this to the fore. I wanted to ask you that you've taken an important lead in addressing and researching these issues, and you've done so much report writing and research in this area. What motivated you to become an expert in the first place?
Well, personal experience, and I think I've told you this before. I'm sure that anyone who embarks on a PhD at some point thinks, I'm doing this for therapy. And it was my experiences of having 25 years working in various aspects of the music industry, being on the receiving end of what I felt was discriminatory behavior in many forms. Could be just a comment or an incident here and there. Or really just looking around a huge room, an award ceremony, or even a boardroom, and just thinking to myself, where are the women? And that penny drops at some point. And so I really got passionate about this, and especially running an organisation which, when I took over as CEO, there were 11 male board directors, one woman, and they'd all been there forever, and it was never they were not interested in changing, and the membership was something like 80% male, but the more senior people on the committees, they were all men, and I really thought that I could help them change and help them modernize and help them do something more. And I did instigate lots of sort of diversity initiatives there with them, and I think I did make a difference. I certainly got them going on that road, but I just more and more wanted to understand what is going on, what is happening, why am I seeing these things, and the only way I was going to be able to uncover that was to do a PhD.
That's fascinating. So there's two elements, the research that you're doing, and I like the idea of PhD as a therapy. It goes so far, but you're right. The questions we ask of our research are no accident, are they? But on the other hand, trying to bring about change from within, and that's where I feel that Fiona's talk was really pertinent, because it's about sort of owning that, the challenges, and then working out together how, or collectively, because it's not just one organisation or institution, how one might address them. So I think those connections are really important. Caroline?
Yes, I was just going to say, I mean, thank you, Vic. There was really useful points there. And Fiona, there's some very fascinating points in your presentation too. And just one I wanted to tease out that I think is still true. Although it's very healthy, I think that we are talking about all of these issues much more freely and openly than certainly when I was a student in the 1980s. And I think back with shame at some of the preconceptions I had myself in the 1980s, despite being educated at a women's college in Oxford. But one of the things is that women, I think is probably still true, take criticism instinctively, more personally, perhaps, than men, so that they might withdraw. You can please shout back and tell me I'm wrong. But my impression is that my male colleagues in this profession tend to bounce back quicker. And it's something that I think women have to challenge themselves about personally, that they make sure they do bounce back and be inspired by the male colleagues.
Well, I can see Lydia nodding here, so I just wondered if you had just a few sentences to respond to that.
Yes, I agree. I think, well, women have always been labeled as being more emotional, in quotes, than men. And I think there is a lot of truth to what you say, Caroline, because I really think that men seem to have more ambition and more fire in their bellies to succeed. I mean, certainly I've seen this my whole life. And of course, when you're younger, I mean, it's easier in a way because all of us have the same ambitions and goals. But that's one reason why I made it a point not to read any of the reviews during the Leeds in 1978, because I did not want to be subjected to any sort of criticism or praise for that matter. I waited until everything was over. And then I had a heyday reading everything with both very good and some snarky comments, and some things were very educational. But you're right. I think women generally will take criticism a little bit more personally and may dwell on it perhaps longer. I'm a very emotional person, and I know that if I had read all of those newspaper clippings earlier, that they might have affected my concentration and my playing.
I think you're also an amazing example of somebody who wasn't going to let anything sort of distract you from the focus that you had in the competitions, and that's brilliant to see. So there are certain stereotypes or certain things that preconceptions that we have to address, but also I'm very interested in that institutional drive to try to find solutions. Before we start to find solutions, because I want to end on a positive note, I want to end on a note that involves all of us, I'd like to hear from another panelist who's joining us remotely. In fact, she's not joining us because she sent us a little video, and it's Ellie Consta. I wanted to hear a voice from a younger generation. And the beauty of this is that it's a really intergenerational discussion, and that's fabulous, and also across different genres. So this is Ellie Consta, who set up she'll tell you herself, her ensemble, an ensemble made up of women and non-binary, and also performing the music of women. So let's hear from Ellie herself.
Hi, I'm Ellie Consta, and I run a group called Her Ensemble. which is a free-form collective that I formed during lockdown for a couple of reasons. The main reason was that I stumbled across this statistic that in 2019, just 3.6% of the classical music pieces performed worldwide were written by women. And that statistic really shocks me, but I was also really shocked that I'd been through music school, music college, into the profession, worked in an orchestra and worked as a freelancer, and I could only name you one. I think I played one piece of music written by a woman at that point, and I think I could have only named you a handful of female composers. So I guess it was out of curiosity as well that I wanted to research and find out, have there been any female composers? Turns out there have been thousands, dating back to 450 BC and probably before that, I'm sure. And the second reason was I think I'd always felt really torn between loving classical music but not really loving all aspects of the scene and not really knowing why. And during the first lockdown, I was living with singer-songwriters and they were asking me to put strings on their tracks, and working with them really allowed me to view music making from a different perspective. But it also made me question why we do things so differently in the pop and the classical worlds. And yeah, I guess I wanted to merge aspects from both of these scenes that I loved, put my own spin on things, shine a light on all of this music that I'd never heard of before and explore it. That's why I named the group Her, after all of these overlooked women. We're also, I guess, challenging expectations of what a classical music group should look like. We often perform in clubs and warehouses, but also in traditional concert venues, trying to make classical music really accessible for everyone. One of the main things that I noticed when I was working with my singer-songwriter friends was dress codes. I'd never really thought of them as an issue, but in orchestra often men have to wear tails and women have to wear long black, which means covering your shoulders and ankles, hiding body hair. Often you're expected to wear elegant feminine shoes if you're a woman. Hide tattoos, hide piercings. I know people have been asked to dye their hair back a more natural colour. So obviously, you can imagine my mind started spinning, and then I thought, actually, where does this leave non-binary people or people who don't fit into those two categories? And how does that play into other issues like sexism and homophobia and racism? So I basically had to re-question everything that I thought I knew about the industry, and I just want to continue exploring and sharing all this music and hopefully inspiring people and making classical music just accessible to everyone. I hope you all have a great day. I'm sorry I can't be there in person, but speak soon. Bye.
Thank you. It's great to have that contribution from Ellie. And in a conversation I had with her, she was also talking about different sorts of leadership that perhaps take on a more working in consensus and working in collaboration with less of a hierarchy, which is a major thing we know, and certainly within the orchestra, within orchestras and in other parts of the industry. And I thought I was really struck by her emphasis on kindness, on listening, and on qualities that might not be associated with certain stereotypes around masculinity. So I had a lovely conversation with her. I'm just delighted that she's reminded us that some of the challenges that we face persist. The piano competition started in 1963. And in 2023, I think, I sometimes take off 100 years because of the era I work on. But in 2023, we're still facing it. And Ellie is an example to remind us that this is very much the case. So I have another. You wanted to come in, do you? No, you do.
Well, I might be misbehaving myself, and you can rule me out of order, Barbara.
I will.
But it was just the comment about concert dress actually is one that has been a lot on my mind recently, because I was helping to supervise a student who was going on about this. And we were talking about all sorts of different kinds of things. I pointed out that the LSO seems to have overhauled their whole approach to concert dress, and it's far less gendered. Then there's the whole issue, if I can just throw this out briefly, surely there's a difference between what a soloist wears and what an orchestra does. And in that an orchestra is sort of, I heard somebody say recently, like a beehive, in that you're working together. It's not about individuals, unless you have a solo, I suppose, but you're working as a kind of machine together. So might clothing reflect that? Unless, of course, you happen to be playing for Andre Rieu, when you wear, if you're a woman, have to wear the most ghastly, I have to say, puffball dresses. So that's highly gendered. That's another extreme. But there seems to be quite a lot in the profession today that people have been thinking about in that. It's not just, you know, your penguin outfit and the equivalent for women.
And also in the popular music industry, there are different pressures and dress codes that reflect some of those issues.
Yeah, I mean, I have looked at that, and I think it's fascinating. It doesn't matter what genre of music you are specialising in. There'll be a dress code particular to that genre, but women are, pressured to have costumes and dresses which are, quite revealing or sexualized. Some it's more overt than others. But yeah, there's that difference across all music genres.
Very quick other footnote. Yuja Wang, it really annoys me that so many reviews today still go on about her outfits. I mean, she's a soloist. She plays fantastically. But God, what a technique. But, all right, I am impressed that she can pedal in those shoes. They're incredible high heels. But, surely it's her playing that's most important. And I wish critics would reflect that more often.
And marketing, of course, of artists and their careers. Okay, so before we start with the solutions, and I'm going to hand over to Linka, you have a moment, and I've told all my colleagues that they're going to, please do participate. What are the persistent barriers for women and non-binary musicians? And that comes out of the discussion that we've had.
Yeah.
So are you able to start? So do keep trying to contribute to this, and Linka will tell us what people have been saying.
I just want to pick up on some of the comments that we've had here on the Padlets. So sexualization of women comes up, and appearance. I think that's quite a regular theme as being a barrier. Cultural assumptions as to what a professional musician should look like as well. So same there. Some comments about deep biases that have significant impact on career opportunities. So this individual says, for example, if I were to name pianists, the vast majority of names I would come up with are of men. And if I were a concert producer, I'd likely start with the names that I already know. So this sort of perpetuates then the situation. In response to the question about what should we do to address the decline in women's participation in the classical music profession, after training, we've got some comments about more supportive environment, possible mentoring programs to bridge the gap between training and professional careers, to provide tailored professional support. So perhaps that's before we move, or it sort of does sound like a solution, but as we move into the solutions, maybe that's something that could be discussed about possible mentoring and tailored support. But something else that's come up here as a barrier, and you were touching on that when you were talking about criticism and how to respond to that criticism, is about imposter syndrome and perfectionism. And there's a comment on about how we need to work on how we relate to and reward women and girls. Maybe from the start we encourage perfectionism and discourage risk-taking. So maybe we need a conscious effort for women to unlearn some of these tendencies when working at a higher level. And there's also some agreement in the chat with that point about imposter syndrome. So this sort of sense of perfectionism, taking on board criticism, putting yourself out there, and sort of, you know, what can we do about that? So I guess those are the things that we could perhaps discuss from the Padlet, and then I'll come back in with some of the points on solutions. So perhaps pick up a couple of those.
Are there any of the points that have been raised about imposter syndrome or responding to criticism, which we heard from Lydia as well, that you want to address?
Yeah, I think within our team we've been having discussions about some of these qualities and challenges, and I'm still concerned that it pushes the responsibility back onto the individual. For instance, the point about, is a woman strong enough to make a big enough sound to get to the back of the concert hall over an orchestra? There is a physical, thing about the piano. It's a very physical instrument, and you do need a lot of strength and stamina. But if you take somebody like Maria João Pires, she doesn't have the biggest sound in the universe, and she's a phenomenal pianist. Shouldn't there be more space for more variety of pianism or musicianship, or and people don't just have to have a career with orchestras playing Rachmaninoff. They can play other things. There's so much music to champion. So I think we've just got to be really careful about looking for that one model of musician that is our ideal of the top pianist or whatever instrument, because you can create too many excuses as to why that person doesn't fit that model, and I think that's part of what's going on.
I like that very much, that idea of conforming to a particular model. And also that the onus is on the person themselves to somehow conform or to change. So Vick, can I bring you in at this point?
Yeah, I think I totally agree with that point. A real feature of post-feminism is, that we don't need feminism anymore because everything's solved. We've got equality. Women, if they're not as successful in certain areas, it's their fault. It's because they don't want it enough. They're not trying hard enough. And I've been told all sorts of very, very similar things to Fiona by very senior men in the music industry over the years about sort of blaming the women. And I think we need to take a good look at our own institutions, which we're doing. This is, so hurrah, we are starting to do that. But every company and institution needs to look at itself and its processes to see what sort of barriers are being put in place that are preventing women from succeeding. In my over 25 years now working in music and previously studying, just about all of the women I ever met or I know or work with, collaborate with, they do not lack ambition. They do not lack persistence, and passion and dedication and, all of these other qualities. And in fact, many women in music are they're firecrackers. They've got so much passion and ambition. So, I think it's not just about fixing the women. It's about looking at organizations and structures as well.
So in terms of looking at structures and institutions, and both of you have worked, are working and worked within institutions at a very senior level, what are some of the solutions? So we heard from Fiona a bit about some of the solutions that you're suggesting and putting in place. Vick, can you respond to that and to what you've done with your organisations? Yeah,
exactly what Fiona was talking about, looking at the data, owning that data, being transparent about the data, setting yourself targets as an organisation, identifying, we're getting everybody on board, especially senior leadership, and then taking staff with you as well, identifying your diversity values, have aims, have a strategy, go for it.
Okay. I like the idea that you're bringing in training for the juries. I imagine that would have been unheard of in 1978. That they would have to do training. Could you say a little bit about that?
Yeah, I think we know there are very, very strong personalities out there over decades and decades of music competitions. Teachers have been invited to give their opinions on artist performances and then be the star makers. But we've never offered them any guidance other than just listen to the music and make your decision. And to me, it's really clear that, as in any other selection process, you need guidance. For the first time, we're actually removing all information from our pre-selection. We're doing it blind. But as the competition goes forward, as Lydia knows, we need to look at lots of different criteria. It's impossible to do behind screen performances. You want to get to know the musician. You want to get to know as much as you possibly can, and that's what the competition process tests through. But at every step, you've got to be talking to your jury about what it means, the responsibility that you've got, and what our aims are to be more equitable and to promote, to really find that balance that we really need in the profession. I think it's going to be a really interesting journey, and starting from setting the tone at the beginning of the competition, saying this is our aim, and these are the things we're going to help you. We're going to go on this journey together, and let's see what difference we can make together.
Caroline.
With your training, it makes me want to ask another question, because I've always understood from Fanny that one of the most innovative things about the Leeds competition was the fact that they did not have a marking system, and that so many competitions assign marks. Now, I've been on the jury of, not the Leeds, but some other smaller competitions, and we didn't have any training, and we were left to find our own way. But I was mindful of what Leeds was always famous for, which was, do you want to hear this pianist again? Does that still apply now?
Yes, and I don't want to speak for the artistic director, Adam Gatehouse, because he and Imogen Cooper are the two who set the rules. But yes, absolutely, that's absolutely the first criteria. But we have a yes/no system, but we do also ask jurors to ascribe marks in case there's a tie. Just speeds things forward. But yeah, we're taking various measures throughout the process so that we've got. It has to be in private. There's no discussion, but we do want to have eyes on the problem that we're trying to solve, which is the gender balance as we go through. So we've put in place measures that we have opportunities to just have a bit more visibility. I think that was what caused the problem in 2021. We had no visibility on it until the votes were cast, and it was a fait accompli. So.
And how does that judging system compare with other major competitions today?
I think it's really quite a mix, but the top ones, several of the top ones work in the same way as Leeds, but Chopin, for instance, is a lot of discussion. They talk well into the night. Usually the decision's about 3 a.m. or something like that. So yeah, everybody finds their own way. But
the one final thing I've heard about the Leeds is that they established rules very early on about teachers not being able to vote for their own pupils, and I think that's just a very important thing to say in passing.
Well, in fact, we don't have teachers on our juries anymore, so that solves that problem.
So opening some of these issues up, and I wondered whether you had sort of solutions that you would like to propose for the industry more widely.
Well, I'm pleased to say there's a lot of really fantastic work going on. I would say, so I did my first sort of formal bit of diversity research back in 2011, and there was virtually nothing at that time going on, and then since then it has just exploded. So on one of my websites. So I set up also, actually, I think it was something a lot of us did in lockdown when we had plenty of time on our hands. I set up a not-for-profit social enterprise called the F-List for Music, which is a directory of women and non-binary musicians who are based in the UK. And there are now over 6,000 listings. And on one of the pages, I call it the sister organizations page. So you can all Google it. And every time I come across an initiative, a project, a charity, an organization that does some work around a particular aspect of diversity in music, mainly based in the UK, I add it and link to it. There are now over 120. So there is incredible work going on. So if you want to look at any sort of type of, it could be disability or ethnicity or sexuality or anything, there is something going on that will, and her ensemble are one of those initiatives. So
Very glad to hear that.
yeah. Which is, and I know women who've worked with them, and it's so there's fantastic work going on, and we all help each other and communicate with each other and share best practice and find out what is working, and it's really exciting, actually.
It's great. It's great to have this conversation that brings together different aspects of the same question, the same problem, and also is looking very actively, proactively, to try and change some of the expectations, the stereotypes, and to propose solutions or different ways of working that might help to address, even in small ways, some of the inadvertent discriminations that might appear to be happening. So, Alinka, do you have any more things to feed in?
Yeah, I just want to bring some things in that solutions that have been suggested online. So some sort of bias or awareness training for agents, in much the same way that you're suggesting bias for the juries as well, with a view to narrowing the gender gap of represented artists. There's a point here about industry quotas. Would that be a possibility? Could there be a precedent for, in some areas, for broadcasters being required to have a proportion of content, different representation, or perhaps from certain regions? There's a comment about creating networks of people that can feed, sort of female or non-binary, that can feed into agents and bookings. So that's a bit like the supportive environment that was being discussed in relation to the first question. There's an interesting question here about surfacing and critical consideration of the values by which we judge musical performance. Do we have gendered aesthetic criteria? So that might be something to raise. And then finally, a point that's come up over several questions has been about digging into details of why people exit the profession or what professions they might go on to do. So, for example, females might be going on to other roles like a choral accompaniment or as a music teacher, and they might be inspiring people, young and old, in music, but we're sort of saying, well, they're not going into the profession, so there's a problem here. So that's quite a lot of different points there.
And just to say that Fanny Waterman was an example of somebody who chose to be the best teacher ever, but then also a leader in terms of what she created in terms of the institution.
There's a very important reason, though, why she first went into teaching, is because during the war she discovered teaching was a protective profession, and that managed to prevent her from having to go and serve in the land army. And she used to think that was very funny.
I think so, that is fantastic. I have read that. It's very, very good. I'm interested in some of the comments, and we will, I mean, if anybody in the room would like to make some suggestions, perhaps building on these comments that have come through online, I'm very happy to throw things open. Oh, Lydia, fantastic. Come on.
Yes, I've had multiple reactions to all of the things that you are saying, and I agree with you completely. And so I would just like to comment on a couple of things. First of all, this issue of wardrobe. Yes, I agree that Yu Zhawang's outfits are often outrageous and certainly not dignified, but she has one of the most successful careers, men or women, today. And obviously, she's an incredible pianist, so whatever she's doing, I mean, I also don't like to read reviews where half of the review talks about her different outfits, but it seems to work for her. Personally, I always used Martha Argerich as my example, both as one of the greatest pianists, not just women, but just one of the greatest, in my opinion, ever. But when she comes out on the stage, and I've been able to hear her several times in person, her outfits are elegant, but very actually simple, and often black. Even when she plays concerto with orchestra, she does not wear a red dress or a green dress. She's very simple. And so therefore, the focus is entirely on her playing. And the wardrobe serves its purpose. Obviously, she looks elegant, she looks wonderful, but it's all about the playing. And my other great musician whom I admired my whole life was Jacqueline Dupre for similar reasons. And what these two women really have in common was that they had their own distinct identities. And I believe that this is something that is incredibly important. And often, I think, in a competition setting, people who do play differently and have more originality, I think, are not always as successful as those who are well prepared, blazing, ready to go, but where the focus is more on really technique, outstanding technique, and perfect playing. And it's very difficult, I think, to forge your own identity. One way, of course, is through sound. I mean, as a pianist, I'm listening to those players who have a different sound, especially if they all play on the same instrument throughout the competition. That's not always the case. But it's fascinating to hear how the same instrument in the hands of different players can have just such a totally different effect. This, for me, is one of the most important things. Now, I've been on the jury for the 2015, the first Van Cliburn Jr. competition, and that question of, would you like to hear this person again, absolutely was one of the rules for judging, and there was a scoring system. In addition, because these were junior contestants, we were required to write comments. And I had 2 sheets of paper. I had the comments that I knew would be going back to the pianist. And then I had, of course, my own notebook where I could write in more detail. And I found that this was also very important because this is really the only way that the pianists get any feedback from the jury. I know that when I was in the Leeds, I had virtually no contact with the jury. And therefore, I'm just going to share briefly this story because this was one of the most remarkable experiences I ever had. In 2019, I was a juror for the first China International Competition in Beijing. And one of the jurors was Arye Bardi, the eminent Israeli pianist who also teaches in Germany. And he was a juror in Leeds in 1978. He was there, but I never met him. And when we met for the first time in the lobby of the hotel, he came over to me, extended his hand, and in the warmest voice said, "Lydia Artymiw, Mendelssohn Fantasy." And I looked at him in complete shock because this was almost 40 years earlier. And he actually remembered that that was the first piece I played in the first round of the competition. So, you know, that is something that will remain as one of my most cherished memories. I never met him at Leeds, but then meeting him so many years later, and that was the first thing he said. And finally, I just want to also add about at the Cliburn, that discussion was absolutely forbidden. And Jacques Marquis, the director, the president of the Clyburn, expressed the thought that some judges have very strong personalities and therefore they will try to dominate and to influence the other jurors. So that was interesting.
That's fascinating, and actually particularly, and that anecdote is wonderful. 40 years later, you find out what he really thought. But that idea of sort of supportive mentoring or at least feedback it seems to be a vital thing. I am going to draw things to a close. We have got time at the bar. And there are many, the conversations will go on, but it's been brilliant to bring together Lydia Artymiw, who's joined us from the United States, Fiona Sinclair from the Leeds International Piano Competition, Vick Bain, who's travelled a million miles to be with us today, but such an expert and an advocate of women in the industry, Caroline Rae, who's a pupil of Fanny Waterman and a pianist and musicologist, and Elizabeth French, who has worked with me on the archive and in discovering some of these things, and in talking to people who are involved in the industry and learning so much. Thanks to Alinka, who's been fabulous there in keeping the connection between the virtual and the actual.
I do actually have one final point to make in that regard.
Okay.
Solutions for the music industry have more vocal, positive role models. Yeah. And I think all of the ladies sat there today, I think we can agree that you're all that. So.
That's an interesting comment, but so there seems to be certain agreement on some of the things we might need to do. Thanks to Dan Merrick, who has masterminded things, and our amazing technical team who have stayed with us through thick and thin, and it's been a complicated technical thing to pull off, so hugely grateful. So please do join us at the bar, and please thank my panellists.